Let's roll.
Hello and welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show. Here you get relevant and timely content you won't find anywhere else. You can learn more by going to mustreadalaska.com, and this show can be found on YouTube, Facebook, X, and your favorite podcast site. Let's talk truth about politics, the economy, and all things Alaska. Now, the host of the show, former state legislator, combat veteran, small business owner, and all-around great guy, Ben Carpenter.
Welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show, friends. I'm Ben Carpenter, your host and guide on this journey of discovery of truth and independent-minded thinking. Must Read Alaska exists because sometimes discovering the truth is hard. It calls upon us to be relentless in defense of common sense, our faith in God, and the exceptional values enshrined in our Constitution. Freedom is not free. It is not for the timid. It was not secured by the weak of heart or mind. Maintaining freedom requires every one of us to be alert to daily encroachments on our liberties and on the grand deceptions of those seeking power and control over others. Every generation must pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, and we must never take our freedom for granted. We are not anti-government, we are pro-government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And today, we have a very special guest with us. I was going to say all the way from Washington, D.C., but he is not in Washington, D.C. right now. He has joined us back in Alaska. Congressman Nick Begich, thank you, sir, for joining us. Good day to you.
Thank you, Ben. Great to be on the show, and looking forward to talking about all things government related, at least on the federal side today.
Yeah, wonderful. I was thinking before the show started that the last time that it was exciting to be a Republican Congress may have been when Speaker Gingrich was pushing the Contract for America. We're at about the 100-day mark since you took office and the new Congress begun. What are Republicans in Congress working on as a team right now?
Well, I'll tell you, there's so much that's happening in the Congress. If anyone has been turning on the news, checking Twitter or Facebook, I mean, anyone who's connected to the political space recognizes that this is probably the most accelerated political velocity that we've experienced in our lifetimes in the first 100 days of this Congress and the first 100 days coming up on President Trump being in office. Look, we're working on all sorts of things, from securing our nation's most southern border to making sure that we're halting the flow of illegal drugs into our communities, making sure that we're putting Americans first in terms of foreign trade, in terms of spending priorities, and making sure that government is becoming more efficient for the taxpayers. We've seen in this first 100 days a number of things uncovered by the Trump administration and by members of Congress that are truly unsettling for anyone who cares about government efficiency and making sure that we've got a government that's working for the people. A number of programs that have been identified that are wasteful at best, and we're looking at what these programs have been doing, who have they been funding, where have those funds been going, because we've recognized that government has become sort of a slush fund for many on the left, and we're shutting that down. We're making government work for the people, and that's been sort of the theme of the first 100 days, getting government more efficient and making it more effective for the people it's supposed to serve. We've been successful at passing a number of bills. One of the most important bills that we were able to pass through the United States House and actually through the Senate and get to President Trump's desk was the Laken-Riley Act. And Laken-Riley Act was named for a young woman who was attacked and brutally murdered by a person that had come into our country illegally and actually had been released by law enforcement back into her community. And it was named in her honor, but it did a couple of things. One, it made sure that we give our enforcement officers, our law enforcement officers, the ability to retain and deport these folks who are in our nation illegally, who are committing crimes. But more important than that, it gave states the ability to sue the federal government when they choose not to enforce immigration law. And we saw in the previous 4 years, states attempt to sue the federal government and told by courts, you do not have the standing to sue the federal government to implement our own laws. And so we wanted to make sure we corrected that. And we actually had enough Democrat support in this particular case to get that over to President Trump's desk and get that bill signed into law. So we're looking for ways to deliver on the promises that were made in the 2024 campaign cycle, and we're being successful at doing that. Up next, though, is going to be a big test. That's the budget reconciliation package that is working its way through the House and then over to the Senate. In order to kick that process off, you've got to go through what's called a budget resolution. The House successfully passed a budget resolution. It was sent to the Senate. They made some amendments to it. It came back over to the House, where it was passed this last week, which unlocks the ability for us to work on budget reconciliation. And within budget reconciliation, the reason that's such an important opportunity is because it's one of the few mechanisms that we have in the Congress to avoid the Senate filibuster, which requires 60 votes. So as long as we get a majority of votes on budget reconciliation in the House and a simple majority in the Senate, we can move a package of priorities to President Trump's desk that's reflective of America First policy and hopefully unlocks a lot of the opportunities that we have around the country, but particularly in Alaska as it relates to resource development.
That's a perfect segue for the first question that I wanted to ask. You're sitting on a resources committee. What do you see as possible for getting into that reconciliation budget bill that will impact Alaska?
Oh, well, I'll tell you this. We've been working on this since before I even swore in. So I saw Steve Scalise during new member orientation. They had yet to even call the race at that point. And I spoke to our majority leader, Steve Scalise, and he said, the first thing he said to me was, "We believe you're going to win." I said, "Yes, sir. I'm quite confident we're going to come out ahead on this race." He said, "Don't worry. We've got some great things in there for Alaska. We've got ANWR." And I said, respectfully, there's a whole lot more to Alaska than ANWR. And I'd love to talk to you about how we ensure that the budget reconciliation package is more comprehensive in its approach to Alaskan resource development. So I sat down with his policy team shortly thereafter, went through a full list of Alaskan resource development opportunities and priorities, and have been working with the House Natural Resources Committee since that time to make sure that ANWR is, of course, part of the package, but opportunities in NPRA are a part of the package, that we're looking at mining opportunities in the state, and hopefully some ways to unlock Alaska's timber industry again. Now, one of the things that's so important to understand about budget reconciliation is that each component of the budget reconciliation bill has to either spend money or generate revenue for the federal government. And so those are sort of the base requirements of a budget reconciliation line item. So the nice thing is for Alaska, many of the areas that I just mentioned, or really all the areas that I just mentioned, are revenue opportunities for the federal government, because the federal government has lands in Alaska and they lease those lands. They make those lands available for lease and generate revenue, which is a budgetary offset. And so that's how ANWR was able to become part of the budget reconciliation process in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So we're using that as a base model to move forward on additional ANWR leasing, but additional opportunities in PRA, in a number of mining areas in the state, and, as I mentioned, timber. And so we're expanding on that. We've got some really great language that should be publicly available in the coming couple of weeks when this moves through the House Natural Resources Committee. But some exciting things for Alaska, and certainly a recognition within the Republican conference in the House that Alaska provides some really unique opportunities for us to reestablish the domestic supply chains that we've heard President Trump identify as a key priority for his administration.
Let me ask what is probably a fairly controversial subject. regarding Alaska's resources and the share with the federal government. And I'm, of course, referring to the 90-10 split or the 50-50 split that has kind of a budget flavor to it because it's talking about money. Do you see an appetite in Congress for readdressing that? Because in my estimation, that would have a giant long-term impact on the state of Alaska if we could return to a 90-10 split, which we're promised.
I totally agree with you. I think that, for leases that have already been awarded, pulling that back to a 90-10 split in budget reconciliation is a real challenge because we're looking for net savings across the board. And, you're going to the table saying, hey, you have, as CBO, identified, hey, this is a certain amount of revenue we're going to receive in the future. And so pulling that back gets difficult. But on new leases, maybe not as difficult. And I will tell you, we have some things pending that we're working with the committee on. We'll see what we can do in terms of how we might be able to creatively reinstate at 90%. We've never achieved it as a state. And it's one of the great missed opportunities for Alaska because Alaska was guaranteed 90% at statehood of all federal revenues coming in from federal lease sales and royalty payments, and that was not honored. And as a result, Alaska, unfortunately, has now moved into the #1 slot for most dependent state in the country in terms of federal dollars. And we really shouldn't be so dependent on the federal government in Alaska, and we wouldn't be as federally dependent if we had been receiving that 90% that you referenced. So it's on my radar screen. We're working on some ways to address that. We'll see if we can get it through budget reconciliation. But whether it's a traditional 50-50 split or a return to the full 90-10 split that was promised to us, it's going to generate a lot of revenue for the federal government and a lot of revenue for Alaska if we can get these priorities that we've already got in that introductory language through the House and over to the Senate and signed into law. The big hurdle on all this is the Senate parliamentarian, because under budget reconciliation, it's the Senate parliamentarian that decides what is considered germane to this. It's a little wonky, but it's called the Byrd Rule. The set of rules that you have to pass in order for something to be considered part of budget reconciliation. But we're doing everything we can do in a language that's being introduced on the House side to create durability and predictability for Alaska's resource future, but also make sure that we can achieve the appropriate hurdles on the Senate side with respect to their parliamentary procedures.
What I suspect is an even more difficult question to address or get things done here is in regards to reducing our national debt, or at least reducing the amount of debt that we're accruing every year. And if my numbers are correct, we're balancing our budget. More than a quarter, 25% of our budget is financed every year at the national level. About $2 trillion every year is added to our national debt. What's the appetite of Congress to rein that in right now?
Well, I think the appetite is high. I think the question is, of course, how do you go about doing that, right? You can do it through raising revenue, which is generally going to be an increase in taxes. I can tell you within the Republican conference, there's no appetite for increasing taxes. You can do that through reducing government spending. Certainly, there's a significant appetite for reducing waste, fraud, and abuse in the system. And what's really been surprising, and I think shocking for almost everyone, is to see just how much waste, fraud, and abuse has been going on. That's the purpose of the Department of Government Efficiency. I'm part of the DOGE caucus in the Congress. And so the Department of Government Efficiency is actually an executive branch function. The DOGE caucus is there to support the identification of some of these programs that need to be revised or looked at, and then also codifying the reductions in spending as they're identified. So that's likely going to happen through what they call a rescissions package, which is a group of actions recommended by the administration that is sent to Congress to say, hey, here are examples of waste or of fraud or of abuse of the system that we want to see permanently eliminated. And then Congress has the ability to then pass those rescissions into law to permanently pull back the spending waste that has been identified by the executive branch. So we're waiting for that first administration so that we can take action on it. When we receive it, rescissions, I believe, don't require the 60 votes in the Senate. And so we can move on that relatively quickly on a rescissions package. We've also been looking at wasteful regulations that the Biden administration put into place, or barriers that they put into place just as they were leaving. They're called midnight rules. And these midnight rules came through just in the waning days of the administration. We've been pulling those out through what are called CRAs. So CRAs allow Congress, again, one of those few opportunities where it only requires a simple majority in the Senate, to repeal Biden-era regulations. And we have a particular window, so we've been kind of focused on that in the last couple of weeks, is identifying these regulations need to be permanently repealed. The beauty of a CRA is not just that you repeal the prior administration's rules, but once that happens, it requires congressional approval for that rule to be reinstated at any point in the future. And so it permanently removes the ability for a future presidential administration to reinstate that set of rules or policies on their own without congressional approval, which is really important.
You call anything a midnight rule, and that just sends all sorts of red flags in my mind.
That's absolutely. But getting back to the heart of your question, because I do want to make sure I spend some more time on that. You talk about the level of interest, just the interest that's going out the door. And when you talk about the amount of interest that's getting paid on our nation's $36 trillion debt every year, we've exceeded $1 trillion in interest payments, and that number is continuing to rise. When you consider also that we have about a $2 trillion deficit, that means that half the deficit spending is interest payments. And interest on the national debt is rising because interest rates are high. So I think in the medium to long term, we're looking at ways to reduce the high interest environment that we're in right now in order to refinance that debt, hopefully at a longer period and a lower rate, so that we can contain the growth of interest rate expense. Because you can do a lot of work in government going through line by line, looking for through the couch cushions and saying, okay, how do we really trim this down? And that's important work, and it hasn't been done in a very long time. So we're finding big opportunities right now in government. But eventually, you've got to address the major problem, which is that interest expense. And the best way to address that interest expense is to get the rates lower and refinance debt over a longer term. Janet Yellen was absolutely derelict in her duties. She was the former Treasury Secretary under Biden, and she refinanced most of America's debt at a time when rates were historically low, near 0%. She refinanced that debt as short-term debt as opposed to long-term debt. So 10 and 30-year treasuries, instead of using those vehicles to lock in low rates, she financed a huge portion of our debt in very short-term bills. And as a result, we have a $9 trillion refinancing activity that's coming in the next 12 months. And when you're in a high rate environment, that gets very expensive. And so you lose the opportunity to have long dated debt obligations at low rates. So we really missed an opportunity with Janet Yellen. She did a very poor job as Treasury Secretary. And I'm hopeful that with Scott Bessent in charge, that we'll be able to encourage the Fed to lower the rates, provide some confidence to the bond markets that we'll be able to pay our debt and meet our obligations, and then find a longer term Treasury curve refinancing opportunity that will lower that net interest expense over time for U.S. taxpayers.
Well, that's encouraging to hear that that we're taking a look at refinancing under better conditions. But I think that most Alaskans and Americans would say that if the first step to dealing with your debt is to stop going into debt.
That's right.
So
the challenge. Absolutely, I agree with that 100%, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think the challenge is that so much debt has already been accumulated that that ongoing interest expense financed at such a high rate makes digging out of the hole even more challenging. So we heard from President Trump during his joint address to Congress, mentioned that he would love to see a balanced budget, and I would love to see us balance budget. I think that is possible over his term. I think it's going to take a lot of courage from a lot of folks across Congress, having hard discussions, going through line by line, and taking a look at exactly the way in which we finance government. We're seeing the tariff policy rolled out. We understand Trump's art of the deal approach can be big bang, and then things kind of move back into a stasis mode that actually can generate quite a bit of revenue for federal government to offset tax pressures and to offset a growing national debt. And so we saw, in fact, that initial 10% tariff that President Trump put onto China in his first term even remained throughout Joe Biden's term. And so that tariff policy turned out to raise a lot of revenue for the federal government to help kind of level the playing field for U.S. producers. And so, looking at a smart tariff policy that will help level the playing field for American workers and American businesses, and at the same time help to plug some of that fiscal gap that we have, I think that may be a part of the solution long term as well.
Yeah, I sure appreciate the tack that's being taken there by the Trump administration. When you're looking at, we already identified cutting spending or raising taxes in order to pay for debt, but really there is a third option, which is to grow your economy. And that is long term the best thing that we could be doing. I'm hopeful that these tariffs, while painful in the short term, will get America back in the habit of winning economically. And therefore you have more taxes. You don't have to raise the rates. You just have to do more. You have to produce more, and then your government has more revenue. I'm hopeful that's what that means.
That's absolutely right, and that's absolutely true. And I know that is a core part of not just the administration's approach, but of Congress's approach. And we certainly look at what are the growth assumptions that are baked into the 10-year budgetary horizon that we look at when we're looking at things like budget reconciliation. We're forecasting where we think the debt's going to be at in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. Growth is a core component of that. Where do we think the American economy is going to be at that point? And one of the things that we got to remember is that the American economy is built and has been built for as long as we've been around on innovation. We protect our innovation through intellectual property protections like patents and trademarks. But when those patents and that intellectual property is not honored internationally, it erodes our ability to export innovation around the world and be rewarded for it. And so you see in the United States a diminished impulse for continued commercial innovation, because a lot of times that innovation costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time, there's a lot of energy that goes into it, and then it's immediately ripped off by folks in China, and there's no recourse in their court system for us to then go and exert pressure on them to say, hey, stop producing these products. You owe royalty payments back to the creators of these innovations. We need them to honor our intellectual property rights in China. And I hope and I believe that is part of the strategy that the Trump administration is rolling out with these tariffs, is to say, hey, we're all for fair trade, we're all for free trade, but fair trade requires that you honor international standards when it comes to protecting intellectual property. And that is a core part of this entire tariff exercise, is to make sure that the Chinese understand we're not going to tolerate them ripping off American businesses and American workers by stealing our innovations, using currency manipulation to keep the price of their final products low on the global market, and then sell them into our own markets with virtually no tariffs. At the same time, we can't enter their markets. I mean, everything you've seen the Chinese do over the last several decades has been anti-competitive. So it's no surprise that the Chinese are very concerned about Donald Trump exerting such pressure on their producers. But it's the right thing to do, and in the end, I think it will prove to have been a good strategy for achieving a level playing field.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that seeing that we have a businessman in the presidency and a business-minded team supporting him, it's encouraging for small business, especially in throughout here. Now, one of the things that challenges small business, it challenges families, it challenges state budgets, is healthcare. And specifically for state budgets, it's Medicaid expenses that we have, especially for the state of Alaska. Um, what do you see happening in Congress to help reduce the cost of Medicaid for states?
Medicaid is a complicated issue, but I'll walk through it at a high level. So Medicaid, of course, we want to protect the Medicaid program as a social safety net for people who truly need it, right? For the disabled, for the elderly that can't pay for the 20% that Medicare doesn't pay for single moms who aren't making enough money to take care of healthcare needs for their children. I mean, there are populations out there that need Medicaid, and the program needs to be preserved for the people that it was intended to serve. And so what's happened over time, however, is that the Medicaid program has grown and it's been abused, much like other areas of government. And let me just give you a couple of examples. So in the Biden era, Medicaid was allowed to grow dramatically because they suspended eligibility checks. And so folks could apply for Medicaid and effectively self-attest and say, yes, I'm eligible for Medicaid. And they're in fact not eligible. And so as a result, the Congressional Budget Office has recently scored the policy, meaning that they've assigned a budgetary savings number for just simply checking to see if people are eligible for Medicaid benefits. And the savings over 10 years is well over $100 billion, may even be over $200 billion, depending on how you check that eligibility. And so, there was an instruction for savings given from the Budget Committee to the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House of $880 billion. A portion of that is going to ultimately be some Medicaid revisions. But you hear in the press people talking about, hey, we're going to cut Medicaid. Well, checking eligibility is not a cut to Medicaid. It's making sure that people on the program are eligible for the program. Other things that are being discussed, and I'll tell you, I support this, basic work requirements for able-bodied recipients of Medicaid. People who can work should be working. And if they're in a community, maybe in an outlying village, for example, in Alaska, that doesn't have employment opportunities, okay, understood, but volunteer. And we're not talking about a high hurdle. We're talking about 80 hours a month. 80 hours a month, right? Contribute to the system that you're drawing from. And it's not a lot of folks, and it doesn't actually mean that someone who then participates in the workforce is going to be kicked off of Medicaid. They may still be eligible for Medicaid. But of course, a lot of private employers, and certainly the government, provides their own healthcare plans that are not Medicaid. So that when you're working, you're contributing to those plans like virtually everyone else who's working. And so there's an intent to make sure that there's some level of accountability for able-bodied people that are generally part of that expanded Medicaid population, making sure that they're contributing. We've also learned this last week that there's over 1 million people in the United States who are not citizens that are drawing Medicaid benefits. 1.3 million, in fact. We learned recently that under the Biden administration, many millions of Social Security numbers were issued to illegal immigrants right out of the gate. And I think the number is over 5 million Social Security numbers who are now receiving Medicaid benefits. And the challenge, of course, is that, again, these programs are intended for a particular part of the American population as a safety net program. They're not intended to be expanded to illegal immigrants who have been coming across our border the last 4 years. And so these are some fundamental, broadly supported line item adjustments to the program that can be made to make sure that the program remains strong for the people that need it the most.
Do you see a role for Congress in reducing the cost of healthcare? And I'm specifically separating that from the conversation about the program that is Medicaid and Medicaid reform to help reduce the cost to state governments and just the overall cost. But what about I mean, healthcare is extremely expensive. So are we talking tort reform? Are we talking insurance reform? What is it that's going to help with reducing
Yeah,
the cost of
I
healthcare?
think anytime you're looking at reducing the cost, you got to just go back to basic economics. So it's a supply and demand equation, and the demand in the United States for healthcare is higher than it should be because the lifestyle that we have lived in the United States is not as healthy as it should be, and so we end up taking conditions that could have been treated earlier in life with earlier interventions or a better, more healthy lifestyle or food supply. And we have made those conditions chronic, which result in a whole series of domino effects. You know, someone who gets diabetes early in life, type 2 diabetes, largely because of a lifestyle issue, not always, but largely because of lifestyle issues, then starts to incur other complicating factors as a result of those diabetes when you look at an entire aggregated population. And so if one of the things that we're dealing with right now is a failure of our regulators to ensure that we had healthy foods and healthy lifestyles, right? And you look at Europe, and you hear a lot of this from RFK Jr., so a lot of this are things that have already been said. But you look at Europe, and the number of allowable ingredients in their food supply is in the hundreds. When you look at the allowable number of ingredients in the United States, it's something like 10,000 plus. And when you just look at the data, the amount of money that is spent in the United States on a per capita basis versus our longevity, which is really the ultimate healthcare outcome metric, how long do you live? When you look at those basic inputs and you chart them out versus every other industrialized nation, you see that we are paying the most and receiving the least benefit from our healthcare system. But part of that is because we've increased the demand. Getting back to my original point, we've increased the demand because we haven't had a government that was ensuring that the inputs into our food system are healthy. The recommendations from the government are healthy. So that needs to be fixed, but it's not going to be fixed overnight. You know, those are things that accrue over decades. And so we're dealing with a relatively unhealthy population in comparison to other industrialized nations. So that's one challenge. Another challenge that we've got that we can address to address the cost of healthcare itself is the way in which pharma companies, large pharma companies in the United States, advertise their products. So anybody who's turned on the TV, watched a football game, watched the news at night, sees commercial after commercial after commercial of large pharma advertising their products. Now, none of these commercials are directed at people who can then go buy the product. They have to go to a doctor, and the doctor has to agree that this particular pharmaceutical product is appropriate for them, et cetera. That's why they always say, ask your doctor about XYZ. So we're one of just a handful, maybe even 2 countries worldwide that allow direct-to-consumer pharma advertising. Now, you know, the challenge with that is they spend so much money advertising their product that in the end, the consumer who finally the healthcare consumer who finally gets prescribed that product pays for the advertising. The healthcare consumer is paying for the ad.
Yeah, that's a self-licking ice cream cone right there.
It really is. It really is. And they understand that it juices demand for their pharmaceutical product. And so, you know, it becomes, as you rightly point out, a self-licking ice cream cone, a self-reinforcing loop of activity that is not good for the consumer, but is great for a pharma marketing company. Now, what's really interesting too is that a lot of these pharma products have not been developed by the company that ultimately sells them to the public. If you look at the way that the pharma ecosystem works, you have R&D companies that specialize in early stage development. Most of the time, those, if successful at, say, a phase 2 or a phase 3 trial, they're ultimately sold off, or they partner with an existing large pharma that has a distribution network and understands marketing techniques, and then can push that product, if successful through the FDA approval process, out to market. And so we've really, in the United States, one of the things that we know how to do better than any other country is sell. And so we have perfected the art of selling pharmaceuticals to the nation. But in many cases, those drugs are not necessary to treat an issue. they may not be the standard of care for treating a particular issue. There may be a generic equivalent that's even better than the new latest and greatest. And of course, it's going to cost a whole lot more. One of the challenges that we see in pharma, again, is that in the United States, which is responsible for about 90% of the world's new drug treatments, patented drug treatments, we pay sometimes more than 10 times what that same drug is offered in another country for. So, for example, you may have some new drug, some new blockbuster drug that comes out in the United States, and it's, say, $10,000 a year, but in another country like Canada, they might pay $1,000 a year for the exact same drug from the exact same company.
Is that a government regulated price, or is that a market driven price?
It's a government regulated price in those nations. And so we who have a relatively unregulated market, and I'm a free market guy, but when I take a look and I say, hey, here's a company that's producing a drug that's exactly the same in the United States as it is in another country, and they're selling it for a tenth of the price in that other country, I say, hey, now wait a minute. The U.S. consumer is paying for healthcare for the entire world, because they put up a barrier, and to the company that produces it, they say, well, I'd rather produce it, because once you complete all the R&D costs and all the marketing costs, all those things, the incremental cost of creating that next dose is extremely small in most cases.
Well, that's where a tariff comes in, right?
Yes. And so, we need to look at global pricing structures for these things, such that, the American healthcare consumer is not footing the bill for global healthcare. And they have for a very long time. And the rest of the world's taken advantage of that ability to basically put pharma R&D for the rest of the world on the backs of the U.S. healthcare consumer, and it's not sustainable. And so there are things that can be done, and things that we're looking at doing in the Congress, and I know in the executive branch as well, to address the fundamental cost of care. Some of those things are long-term, some of those things are short-term.
Social media has been on fire with Secretary Kennedy's pushes that he's, taking to make America healthy again. And it seems to me that if he's successful, which I certainly hope that he is, our healthcare industry, one, should get less expensive, and two, it might not be as wise an investment in the short term.
And I think most healthcare professionals, certainly the providers themselves, we're talking about techs and nurses and doctors, specialists, they want what's best for their patients. And and I think all of them, if you walked into any primary care physician office, they'll tell anyone, I don't care if they're 5 years old or 50 years old or 100 years old, here are some things you need to do to lead a healthier lifestyle. So, every practitioner out there wants their patients to be healthy. We need to make sure that government wants us to be healthy too. And if we properly invest in healthy lifestyle, healthy foods, we're going to have better long-term outcomes in this country. And that's what we should expect government to help us do, because the truth of the matter is the average person out there does not have the ability to go pick through every single ingredient, every single detail to make, a 100% fully informed choice about every single thing they do when it comes to food. A lot of this we're counting on government to come in and say, hey, this is healthy, this is not healthy. These are things that we have to exclude from the food supply, for goodness sakes. And government has really, there's been some regulatory capture by large pharma and large food companies over many years, where, and this is another sort of in the weeds thing, but it really matters for people, where they've been able to self-attest and say, these particular ingredients, don't worry, we've tested it, it's fine. And there's no check on the government side to say, okay, well, show me where that's fine. Prove to me that this is healthy. And we have basically outsourced that to large food producers, and they've said, well, we've got these various ingredients, we'd like to introduce them in the food supply. No one checks. There are no studies. There's no information to say that this is good or bad. And so I think for me, and again, as a conservative free market guy, I think that's a problem. Because again, you're counting on the public to be able to parse that out. And there's no way that people are going to be able to do that on their own.
Is there, and I know that part of the push with Secretary Kennedy is focused on eating healthier. Um, when there's a nexus there, when there's a connection between a social safety net and the money that's being spent to help people eat, can that money be earmarked either by regulation or permanently by statute to not be spent on unhealthy food? Like if I've got welfare money, do I go buy a Coke with it? Like, is
I
that
agree.
allowed?
You wouldn't believe the lobby on the Hill on this.
Oh,
It's
I completely understand it.
yeah, it's pretty incredible. But you shouldn't be able to walk in and buy a rock star on Snap. That
Right,
doesn't make
exactly.
sense, right? You shouldn't buy a Red Bull on Snap. It just doesn't make any sense that's what we would be doing with money that's there to ensure that people have nutritious food to eat as part of our government safety net program with SNAP benefits. And now I'm all for it. I think if you're on those programs, we should provide healthy food, and healthy food is going to be hopefully a part of the solution to making sure that people have the ability to then get off of those programs, right? And so we don't want to make people unhealthy in this country. We don't want to subsidize that either. But you would not believe the number of companies that are very concerned that part of their business is going to be impacted by the health policies coming from the
Well,
Trump
and
administration.
I think that's the biggest challenge that Congress has with regard to reining in spending are those constituencies, businesses that are tied to federal dollars. And that is a
Absolutely.
culture shift that we're going to have to make.
That's 100% right. That is so true. I can't even tell you across the board. And, this sort of government spending regime has been allowed to sort of emerge over time, such that there's this strange combination between tax dollars and businesses that otherwise should be competing in the private sector, but are fundamentally subsidized by not just taxes, but money that we don't even tax and we borrow in order to
Yeah,
support them.
absolutely.
And we have to put government back in its proper constitutional lane and allow the free market to actually operate as it was originally intended. And when we do that, you're going to have less tax burden, lower inflation over a long period of time, and an ability to finally get that debt that we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast under control, because interest rates will be lower.
We're nearing the end of our time together today, and I sure appreciate you coming on board and having a conversation. I wanted to ask one last question, and it was something that you brought up, and I wanted to dive in just a little bit. At the very beginning, you said that there is money that has been identified that might have been going into the political sphere, the campaign sphere. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, do we kind of know how much of the electioneering that's happening, or the money that's being spent in elections, is actually being financed by federal dollars in some form or fashion, whether it's a grant or whatever, this circuitous path that it takes that ends up getting spent for election purposes? Do we have an idea of how much has, where that's coming from and how much it's been?
We don't yet, okay, but I know that the folks in oversight and certainly in the administration are trying to trace that out. And part of the challenge, of course, is that money goes out into a particular program, and if it makes its way back into our elections, then there's a couple of different ways it could be happening, right? So one, we know for a fact, is that the money goes out to an NGO, and then that NGO's leadership team then turns around and donates to particular causes or politicians, campaigns, et cetera. So that's not unusual. I mean, it's pretty easy to track and identify whether that's going on. The question that is a little harder to determine, but is being reviewed right now, is has money gone out in particular grant programs and then turned around and funneled back into the system through straw donors? And we've seen some folks who've gone out to really heavy donors, right? And it's all public, so you can see in Act Blue or even WinRed how many people are donating like hyper frequently, where you'll have someone donate say 100, 200, 300 times a day to various candidates around the country. And they're doing this in $5, $10, $15 increments. And you say, okay, I could see someone doing that a couple of times a day because they're, really engaged in the space. But hundreds of times a day at $5 or $10 increments doesn't make sense. And so you actually have seen people go out to those folks' houses and knock on their doors in person and say, hey, just wanted to check, did you send $500,000, $15 at a time to these people over the last year? And these people respond and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. Now, where did that money come from? It didn't come from them. They're saying that wasn't me. And yet you're seeing the small dollar operation, particularly in Act Blue, but it's ever present, but particularly in Act Blue, drive so much of the campaign fundraising. And it looks grassroots, but when you find out a couple layers down, wait a minute, these people have no idea it's happening. Someone is sending money, some entity or some person is sending money in their name to campaigns. And so that's the piece that we really are trying to trace out. You can trace it out to some degree by backtracking the flows through the payment processing companies. But for a while, we're told that Act Blue was actually allowing gift card donations, which then makes trying to trace some of this out more difficult because it's sort of dead ends at one particular spot. But I know that the oversight committee in the House is looking at it. I know there's members in the Trump administration that are investigating this because, look, we need to make sure that the money that's coming in to finance campaigns is coming in legally and it's coming in from Americans. It's illegal for foreigners to donate to American federal campaigns by law. And if this is identified as having actually occurred and we can identify the people that did it, they need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent. We impeached a president, I didn't, but the Congress impeached a President Trump, over alleged interference through Russia and claimed all these things about Russia that were provably false and proven false. And if we are seeing foreign interference or interference like this through straw donors, those people truly need to be prosecuted and made an example of, because that cannot continue. It's distorting electoral outcomes and misrepresenting the will of the people.
Well, I certainly believe that most Americans are going to agree upon the foreign influence within our election system. I think it might get a little bit more tentative in when you start having a discussion about certain organizations domestically who are tied to federal dollars influencing, right? Because then you've got freedom of speech issues, and I get to spend my money how I want. But if ultimately the federal dollars are the ones that are being spent through these organizations to influence local elections, even state or federal elections, then what you basically have is this bureaucracy, the unelected bureaucracy that's able to influence the outcome of elections to support and further the unelected bureaucracy and the continuation of the problem, which is
that when that happens, you're done as a nation. You're done. I mean, when you saw, for example, Stacey Abrams set up this group, Stacey Abrams, a Democrat activist who ran for governor, lost her governor's race in Georgia, actually claimed election fraud in her own race, and then later, acted like that had never happened. But setting that aside, she set up a nonprofit with some partners apparently that had only done a very de minimis level of activity in the previous year, was awarded over $1 billion, I think maybe $2 billion, for some eco objective that they had identified. And so, the program was funded again in the midnight hours of the Biden administration, and the Trump administration has been working to claw those funds and other funds that were distributed through the same methodology back. But it was purely a political favor, just political favors paid out to these people. And of course, you got to believe that a lot of that money will ultimately, if not clawed back, it's going to make its way back into our election system. So, there's the two categories we talked about, where somebody who works for an NGO and their management team may donate to a candidate after they've gotten funding. You've got the situation of straw donors, but then you also have a third category where you've got NGOs that can send money to a C4 organization that can then spend up to 50% of its funds on political campaigns. And that is completely dark money. There is no way to trace that out unless the IRS were to open the books. And so under the law, it's permitted to spend money as a C4 that way. And there's no way for us to know, when you see the ads that aren't coming directly from the campaigns, they're coming from some third party. How are those financed? Where did that money come from? We suspect that a lot of that money has come from the NGO space back into the political space in a way that prevents the public from ever being able to audit where the flows of that cash came from. But when you see as much money coming, what's that?
I said, perhaps maybe the next election, if we see a decline in the amount of money that's being spent, which would be an anomaly, or it would be strange to see that, perhaps that's the answer that we're, of the question is where was the money going? It's not going here.
Could be. That's right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been enlightening, and it's great to see your face. I hope you're having fun there in Congress. I know it could probably be a battle of wills most days, but we sure appreciate you doing it for us and the work that you're doing there in Congress. I appreciate it from a personal level, and having served in the state legislature, I know that it can be a challenge and taxing on your mental state, your family, everything. So I sure appreciate the sacrifices that you make to do it. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Ben. It's an honor to do the job. And, we're fighting every single day to make sure that Alaska has the opportunity to thrive. That's the goal. We want to open up industry in the state. We want to make sure there's long-term jobs for people in the state, that we can build our lives here with confidence, that young people, when they graduate high school, are looking forward to a job in Alaska, building their families in Alaska. And part of that, of course, is making sure you've got a strong economy. And part of having a strong economy is having predictability around the resources that we have the ability to develop in Alaska. So that's the goal. I'm working hard to do it. I've been fortunate to have gotten some bills passed already that have some national implications, but also some state level implications. I'm encouraged about what we're going to see in budget reconciliation. And I'm hopeful that we're going to have a future for Alaska that's even stronger than our past.
Thank you, Congressman Begich, for being with us today. If you're listening to this show and you want to help support the show and help us keep the lights on, then please go to mustreadalaska.com, click on the donate link, and your support will be greatly appreciated. Well, this is the end of the show. Thank you, Congressman Begich, for being with us. Until next time, stay frosty out there.